The year is 1962. A Soviet nuclear missile is pointing at every major American city, and the United States military has one terrifying problem that nobody has solved. If Moscow fires first and hits Washington, every single military command line goes completely dead. America cannot fight back, cannot respond, cannot even communicate, and the most powerful military on Earth would be blind, deaf, and paralyzed in under 4 minutes flat. That problem, that single catastrophic vulnerability, is the reason you are watching this video right now. Because the solution the American military came up with to survive a nuclear strike did not just save their communication lines, it accidentally created the most powerful and transformative technology in human history. Stay with me, because this story goes places nobody ever tells you about. Before we go forward, we need to go back. Way back, to the 4th of October 1957, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik into orbit above the Earth, a satellite roughly the size of a beach ball that did absolutely nothing except emit a repetitive radio beep. And that beep, that simple, almost comical beep from a metal sphere floating in space, sent the entire United States government into a full-scale panic that would permanently and irreversibly change the course of human history. Because what that beep was actually saying, what every general and politician in Washington heard when they listened to it, was this: if the Soviets can put an object into space on top of a rocket, they can put a nuclear warhead on top of that same rocket and drop it anywhere on Earth they choose, including Washington, including New York, including every military installation and command center America had ever constructed. And the technological gap between the two superpowers had just become terrifyingly, undeniably, publicly real. The American government's response was immediate and without precedent. In 1958, President Eisenhower created a brand new government agency called the Advanced Research Projects Agency, known as ARPA, whose sole stated mission was to ensure the United States was never caught technologically behind a rival nation again. And it was given no meaningful budget limit, no bureaucratic constraints, just the smartest scientists America could find and an open check from the most frightened government on the planet. But ARPA had an immediate and deeply embarrassing problem that nobody had solved. Their scientists were spread across the entire country, at MIT in Boston, at UCLA in California, at Stanford, at the University of Utah, brilliant minds working on critical national defense research in complete isolation from each other. And if one team discovered something vital, the only way to share it with another team was to physically print it out and mail it in an envelope. In 1958, during the most dangerous nuclear standoff in human history. And then there was the bigger problem. The one that genuinely kept generals awake at night staring at the ceiling. Because all of America's military communication ran through centralized hubs, telephone exchanges, command centers, and control rooms, all connected to each other through single fixed lines, which meant that one well-placed Soviet nuclear strike on the right city at the right moment could sever every single military communication line in the country simultaneously, and the most powerful nation on Earth would have nothing left to say to itself. This is where a man named Paul Baran walks into our story, and Paul Baran is genuinely one of the most consequential and most completely forgotten people in the history of modern civilization. A Polish-born engineer working at the RAND Corporation, which was the United States military's private think tank, who spent 2 obsessive years working on one single question that everyone else had given up on. How do you build a communication network that simply cannot be destroyed, even by a direct nuclear strike on its heart? Baran's breakthrough was a concept so elegantly simple and so structurally radical that the military establishment flatly refused to believe it could work. He called it distributed communications, and the core idea was this: instead of all messages traveling through one central hub, the way all roads lead to Rome, what if every message was broken into small individual chunks, and each chunk was allowed to find its own separate route to the destination, through whichever pathways happened to still be working, with no center, no single point of failure, and nothing critical enough to destroy. Think of it this way: if you write a letter and the post office burns down, your letter is gone and the message is lost forever. But what if instead you tore that letter into 12 separate pieces, put each piece into its own individual envelope, sent each envelope by a completely different route, through a completely different city, and they all reassembled themselves at the destination in the correct order? so that even if 3 envelopes were destroyed along the way, 9 pieces still arrived and the full message was still readable. That was Paul Barron's idea, and that idea, in its most essential form, is the Internet. Barron published his complete idea in 1964 across 11 meticulously documented volumes of research, handed the entire framework to the United States military on a plate, fully worked out, fully tested in theory, and entirely free of charge, and the military passed it to the phone company AT&T to evaluate. AT&T, who controlled every telephone line in America and had absolutely no commercial interest in anything that threatened their monopoly, looked at 11 volumes of world-changing research and told the military it was completely impractical and could never be built by anyone. AT&T was catastrophically, historically, embarrassingly wrong. But their rejection delayed the entire project by years. And here is what makes this particular moment so fascinating and so maddening, because Barron's idea did not stall because it was flawed or unworkable or ahead of its time. It stalled because the organization with the most power to say no also had the most financial reason to say no. And the most important communication technology ever conceived was nearly strangled completely in its crib by a telephone company that was simply protecting its existing business model. Meanwhile, completely independently and with no knowledge of Paul Barron's work whatsoever, a British scientist named Donald Davies working at the National Physical Laboratory in England was developing the exact same concept from an entirely different starting point. He had never read a single page of Barron's 11 volumes. Barron had never heard his name. And yet 2 men on opposite sides of the Atlantic, working in complete isolation from each other, had arrived at the identical revolutionary idea at almost exactly the same moment in history. Because sometimes the world is simply ready for something, whether one genius finds it or not. Davies gave the concept the name that the entire world would eventually use. He called the individual chunks of broken up data a packet, and he called the system of sending them packet switching. And those 2 words stuck so completely and so permanently that they are still the precise technical terms used to describe how every single piece of data moves across the internet right now as you watch this video. Every email, every message, every video stream, all of it traveling in packets, named by a British scientist whose name appears in almost no history book written for a general audience. Back in America, ARPA was finally ready to stop theorizing and start building. In 1966, a young computer scientist named Lawrence Roberts was brought in specifically to take Barron's theoretical framework and turn it into an actual functioning network. Roberts was barely 30 years old. He had a budget that was modest by military standards. He had exactly 4 universities willing to connect their computers together as a starting point. And he had the most extraordinary and terrifying brief in the history of technology. Build a communication system that can survive the end of the world. Here is the detail that stops almost everyone cold when they hear it for the first time. The very first message ever sent across what would eventually become the Internet was transmitted on the 29th of October 1969, from a computer at UCLA in Los Angeles to a computer at the Stanford Research Institute in San Francisco. The message was supposed to be the single word login. The system crashed catastrophically after the first 2 letters were received, and the first ever Internet message in human history, the opening word of the greatest communication revolution ever, was simply "low," followed by silence, followed by a system crash. They fixed the crash within an hour and successfully sent the complete word. But think about what that moment actually represents. The technology that today carries 2.5 quintillion bytes of data every single day, a number so astronomically large that it has no meaningful comparison to anything in ordinary human experience, began its existence with 2 accidental letters and a technical failure, as if the Internet itself was saying hello to the world in the only way it currently knew how, and the world had absolutely no idea that anything of significance had just occurred. By 1970, the network, which had been officially named ARPANET, connected 15 universities and research institutions across America. Scientists could share data with each other in seconds rather than weeks. Research that had previously taken months to communicate across the country now arrived almost instantaneously, but the network was still entirely military and academic in its access, completely closed to any member of the general public, and the ordinary American citizens whose tax dollars had funded every single dollar of its construction had absolutely no idea it existed. And here is the moment where the story takes a turn that nobody planned, nobody authorized, and nobody predicted. Because the scientists and researchers who were using ARPANET for its intended military and academic purposes, started doing something the network had absolutely not been designed for. They started talking to each other personally, casually, informally, sending messages that had nothing whatsoever to do with defense research, jokes, opinions, arguments about science fiction novels, observations about their days, and every single one of these personal messages was technically in violation of ARPANET's official usage rules. In 1971, a programmer named Ray Tomlinson sent the first properly structured email in history, and in doing so, he needed a symbol to separate a user's name from the name of the computer they were using. So he looked at his keyboard, saw the @ symbol sitting there unused because it appeared in no human names and served no current purpose in computing. And in approximately 30 seconds of casual decision-making, he chose it. That 30-second choice gave the entire world the @ symbol that now appears in over 5 billion active email addresses. And Tomlinson later admitted with complete honesty that he could not remember what the first email actually said. But ARPANET still had a fundamental structural problem threatening to collapse the entire project from within. Every computer manufacturer in the world built their machines to speak a completely different technical language. So connecting computers from different manufacturers was like placing an Igbo speaker, a Mandarin speaker, and a Portuguese speaker in the same room, and expecting them to have a fluent conversation with no translator present. And every new computer added to the network required a completely custom-built individual connection, making the system slower and more complicated and more fragile with every single machine that joined it. The solution came from two men working together, a scientist named Vint Cerf and an engineer named Bob Kahn, who in 1974 published a paper describing a universal technical language that every computer on every network anywhere in the world could use to communicate with every other computer, regardless of who made it or how it was built. They called it TCP/IP, standing for Transmission Control Protocol, an Internet protocol. And it was the precise moment the Internet received its universal grammar, its common tongue, the single technical decision that made one genuinely global network possible, instead of thousands of separate, incompatible ones. Cerf and Kahn did not patent TCP/IP. They did not sell it. They did not attempt to extract a single dollar from what was arguably the most commercially valuable technical specification ever written in the history of computing. They gave it to the world entirely and unconditionally for free because they believed, and this belief was the foundation of everything they built, that the network only functioned at its full potential if absolutely everyone could access it freely. And the moment you placed a price on the language that everyone needed to speak, the conversation that made the whole thing valuable would simply stop. On the 1st of January 1983, ARPANET switched permanently and completely to TCP/IP. And this date, rather than the first message in 1969, or the first email in 1971, is what most serious computer scientists consider the true and actual birthday of the Internet as we understand it today. Because it was the day that every computer on the network began speaking the same language for the first time, the day the Internet stopped being a classified military experiment and became a technology with a genuine structural potential to connect the entire world, even though the entire world still had no access to it whatsoever. Now we need to talk about the man who took all of this military and academic infrastructure and transformed it into something that your grandmother can use on a phone the size of her palm. His name is Tim Berners-Lee, a British scientist working at a particle physics laboratory in Switzerland called CERN in 1989. And he was not trying to build the Internet or improve the Internet or expand the Internet in any way. The Internet already existed. He was trying to solve a much smaller and much more specific problem that was making his own daily working life, personally and professionally, frustrating. CERN employed thousands of scientists from dozens of different countries, all working simultaneously on overlapping research. And every single one of them stored their work on their own individual computer in their own individual format. So when a scientist finished their contract and left CERN, their entire body of research effectively vanished with them, locked in a format nobody else could read on a machine nobody else had access to. And Berners-Lee wrote a memo to his supervisor describing the problem and proposing a network solution. And his supervisor read the entire proposal and wrote just 3 words in the margin. Vague but exciting. And those 3 dismissive words nearly buried the World Wide Web before a single line of it was ever written. Berners-Lee ignored the lukewarm response entirely and kept building in whatever time he could find between his official duties. and by 1990 he had created 3 distinct things that collectively changed everything about how human beings access and share information. First, he created HTML, the language for building web pages. Then he created HTTP, the system for transmitting those pages across the internet. And then he created the URL, the addressing system that allowed any person to find any page anywhere in the network. 3 foundational inventions from one man in 18 months, and he gave all 3 of them to the entire world completely and unconditionally free. On the 6th of August 1991, Tim Berners-Lee published the world's very first website at an address called info.cern.ch, and it had no images, no color, no design, no video, no sound, nothing except plain black text on a white screen, explaining what the World Wide Web was and describing how anyone could use it. And that website, the first one in the entire history of human civilization, is still live and still accessible online today, sitting in the same vast internet neighborhood as Netflix and YouTube and every other website that has ever existed, a plain humble text page that started everything. The growth that followed was unlike anything recorded in the history of human technology at any point across any era. In 1993, there were 130 websites in existence across the entire world. By 1994, there were 10,000. By 1995, 100,000. By 1997, 1 million. By 2017, million. And today there are over 1 billion active websites on the internet, meaning a technology that began with a single plain text page in a Swiss physics laboratory went from 0 to 1 billion in less than 30 years. And nothing in the entire recorded history of human innovation, not electricity, not the telephone, not television, not aviation, has ever scaled at remotely that speed. And here is the part that should genuinely make you stop and sit with it for a moment. Every single person who built the foundational technical layer of the internet gave their work away to humanity completely free of charge. Paul Baron published his packet switching research free. Donald Davies named it and documented it free. Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn gave TCP/IP free. Tim Berners-Lee gave HTML and HTTP and the URL free. And the entire technical foundation of a technology that now contributes over $30 trillion annually to the global economy was handed to the world without a single patent filed by any of the people who actually built it. The people who became incomprehensibly wealthy were not the inventors who built the foundation. They were the entrepreneurs and corporations who arrived after the foundation was already laid and built commercial structures on top of it. Amazon, Google, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft, with a combined market value exceeding $10 trillion, all of it constructed on infrastructure that was deliberately and philosophically handed to the world for free by scientists who genuinely believed the network only functioned at its highest potential if no single person or company owned the language everyone needed to speak to participate in it. The nuclear war question, the one this whole story started with. Did the internet actually achieve what it was designed to do? Did it actually build a network capable of surviving a nuclear strike, the way Paul Baron originally envisioned? And the honest answer that most documentaries and textbooks quietly skip over is this. The early ARPANET was genuinely designed and structured with nuclear survival as its primary engineering goal, but the modern internet as it actually exists today is considerably more vulnerable than its founders ever intended, or would have accepted. The dream of a truly decentralized and indestructible network that Baron sketched on a notepad in 1962 has been gradually and quietly replaced over decades by massive centralized data centers, a relatively small number of critical undersea fiber optic cables, and enormous commercial cloud server facilities, meaning that a targeted and coordinated attack on fewer than 100 specific physical locations around the world could severely and potentially catastrophically cripple global internet access. The very centralization that Baron's entire design was built specifically to eliminate has crept silently back in through 60 years of commercial convenience and corporate consolidation. There are currently approximately 4 billion people actively using the internet, representing 67% of every human being alive on Earth at this precise moment in history. And to understand the true scale of that number, consider this. In 1969, this technology connected exactly 4 computers in 2 American universities. In 1983, it connected a few thousand machines across academic institutions. In 1993, it connected roughly 1 million users worldwide. and today it connects 5.4 billion people, meaning that in 55 years a classified military communication experiment, born from the existential terror of nuclear annihilation, grew to connect 2/3 of the entire human race. And yet, and this is the number that sits uncomfortably beside every celebration of the internet's reach and power, 2.9 billion people on this earth still have no internet access whatsoever. And in a world where internet connectivity now determines access to education, to medical information, to economic opportunity, to political participation, to the basic ability to communicate with the wider world, those 2.9 billion people are entirely and structurally excluded from the most powerful tool humanity has ever collectively built. A tool that was specifically and philosophically designed from its very beginning to be free and to belong to absolutely everyone. Tim Berners-Lee, the man who invented the World Wide Web, gave it unconditionally to the world and watched it become the defining technology of human civilization, has spent the last decade actively and publicly fighting to reclaim what the internet was supposed to be, because he believes with complete conviction that the web was designed to be open, equal, decentralized, and owned by nobody. And instead it became the property of a small number of extraordinarily powerful corporations who monetized human attention at industrial scale, harvested personal data without meaningful consent, and built surveillance and manipulation systems of a reach and sophistication that would have seemed like dystopian fiction to anyone reading that first plain text webpage in 1991. A Soviet satellite the size of a beach ball beeping in the dark above a frightened planet. A Polish engineer's sketch of broken messages finding their own way home. 2 accidental letters and a system crash in a California university at 2 in the morning. A 30-second decision about an unused symbol on a keyboard. A memo from a supervisor that said vague, but exciting and nearly ended everything. A plain text web page with no images and no color that changed everything anyway. That is the complete and actual chain of events that built the technology you are using right now to watch this video. And the internet was not invented by visionaries confidently building the future. It was built by frightened and stubborn and occasionally ignored people desperately trying to survive the present, and it became everything anyway. If this story made you see the internet differently, then you're exactly the kind of person this channel was made for, because there are more stories like this, hidden in plain sight, shaping the world you live in every day. So, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.